Hello everybody, my name is Linehan Young, and I will be reading a passage from Being Mary Rowe. First I'll start with the prologue. Newfoundland, January 21st, 1891. Men lined the shore like setters pointing on a dock, silent, their gazes fixed on the schooner in the distance. It had been 4 days since the derelict vessel first appeared in the bay. One of the young Ryan boys from North Harbour noticed it while out bird hunting in the rocks on the point. The winter storm had brought 3 days of southwest winds and blowing snow. It had also brought the ship. The storm blew itself out, and the boat, which appeared to have been taking shelter behind Colnet Island, had carried on the tides north toward the point amid thin pans of ice. This wasn't the first time an abandoned ship had drifted within reach of the communities of North Harbour and John's Pond. In '87, some of the livyers had found another vessel on the rocks and were able to scavenge ropes, barrels, food, and wood from the wreck. Now, mostly these same menfolk waited in the cold winter morning for the chance to recover the bounty served up by the latest storm. The rocks, stretching out into the sea, were covered with polished, 2-inch thick ice formed by the sea spray of the last few days. It was risky to attempt a rope until the boat was close enough for a good throw of the grappling hook. Once snared, they would pull the boat close enough to tether it to the old gnarly spruce tree on the point. Until then, they would wait. The calm sea was taking its sweet time. The fire they had set on the beach had long gone unattended in anticipation of the trove. Finally, the call went out to try the rope. All hands were in agreement when Pat Linehan, arguably the best to throw among the bunch, positioned himself on the wet rocks near the base of the fire pit. The driftwood-fueled fire had thawed a ring about 4 feet in diameter, which would keep him from slipping. His black rubber boots skidded a little as he, a pudgy man in his mid-40s, dug his toe into the beach rocks to get better footing. He grabbed the rusted metal of the small anchor, bent low, and heaved with all his might. If he missed, the hook could tangle in the small pans of ice that were banked on and near the shoreline, and they would be there for hours, trying to work it loose. Untangling would be treacherous, and they would have to wait another day. The hook landed with a thud on the deck almost 30 feet away, and a cheer went up from the anxious crowd. They all grabbed hold of the rope with mitted hands and pulled in unison. Before too long, the boat scraped on the rocks and ice pans. It was as close as they could get it. They were lucky the tide had been coming in and was almost high, or the trek to the beached vessel would have taken that much longer. The men stretched 2 weather-beaten wooden ladders out across the uneven, ice-covered expanse. End to end, they almost reached the hull. David Rourke walked out the length of the makeshift bridge, balancing another, conceivably the best of the ladders, across his body. When he reached the boat, he raised the ladder, bracing the bottom in the slushy ice pan, with the top resting on the frozen gunwale. He held it fast as the men crossed to him and scaled the hull. The last man held the rail's end, and he climbed up. The boat was listing, but remained steady under the slight ebb and flow of the tide. Several men went to work on the sails and lines above deck, while 6 of the 14 went below. Whatever was retrieved would be shared, and each man would take only what he had use for. The boat would stay tied as long as the winter storm would allow. Whatever board and planks that remained would be used to build or repair stables and houses in either of the communities. Material from the 40-foot schooner will be split among those who needed the timber. Pat came up from below. his body heaving as he lost what little breakfast he had that morning. He was quickly followed by the other 5 men, each one retching. Pat spoke first. "There are men below. I think they're dead." His younger and slightly taller brother Jim spoke up. "I believe I heard somebody moan." David, a tall, stout man in his early 50s, still sporting a crop of light brown hair beneath his grey woolen cap, pondered the situation for a few seconds. "We'll need to check. I'll go. Pat, you come with me." Pat shook his head. "I'll not go. The smell is horrible. They're surely all dead." "I'll go with you," said Jim. "I know I heard a moan." David slowly walked toward the hole and descended into the bowels of the vessel. "Over there," said Jim. He pointed in the darkness below. David's nostrils filled with the most wretched stench he believed he had ever smelled. He struck a match on the beam and saw a piece of candle almost melted into the crude wooden table to his left. He lit the wick, scraped the candle from its resting place, and shone the dim light on several bunks in the bow. He heard Jim gulp for air behind him. David's stomach rolled, and he held his fingers to his nose, trying not to vomit. He moved towards the bunks. The 6 of them were indeed occupied. Tattered woolen blankets fully covered 3 of the men on the bottom bunks. He pulled back the first sheet. The man was clearly rigid in death. He made the sign of the cross by rote. It wasn't recent either, by the smell. He could be dead a week, with the frost perhaps even longer. David didn't bother looking under the rest of the blankets of the lower bunks. He believed they would all be dead and that someone had taken the time to cover them. 3 men in the upper bunks hadn't had the same treatment. "Are they dead?" Jim asked behind him. "The 3 below are. I'll check the ones on the top." David stood and peered at the first partially covered figure. He wasn't moving. David felt the man's head. He was cool and clammy and didn't respond to the touch. "Sweet Jesus, what happened here?" he said under his breath. He moved to the second fella. Unlike his bunkmate, he felt scalding hot. The man moaned and reached for David's arm. "This one's alive." He swiftly checked the last person. "We need to get them to Dot, quickly." David shouted to the men on the deck to make something to carry the sick crew. The foraging forgotten, the men quickly made barrows from the masts and sails, worked to get each man up on the deck, and then fastened them to the makeshift stretchers. The strangers coughed and wheezed as they were being moved. "We're taking them to the nurse?" Jim asked. "Yes, my wife will know what to do," David said. By the time they made it to the point of the community, the sun was high in the sky and they were all tired. 12 men piled into David's house, carrying the 3 patients. "Dot, Mary, come quickly, we need your help." Dot, a striking dark-haired woman in her mid-50s, came from the pantry. The splash of grey near her temples was the only thing betraying her age. Mary, pushing her red hair back into a bun, came down the stairs a few minutes later. In her mid-20s, she'd become well accustomed to summonses from her mother to help with the sick and injured. "Help me, girl," Dot said. "Go back and grab some blankets." One of the sick men coughed and doubled over while gasping for air. "Cover your face, too," she directed the man to lay one of the sick on the daybed, while the others were placed on the floor near the stove. She couldn't say which was worse off. 2 were fevered and quite sick. Dot put her ear to the 3rd man's chest and then his mouth. She shook her head. "This one's gone." Dot questioned her husband while 4 men hastily removed the dead fellow. The rest of the crowd backed out into the porch and spilled out into the lane. The one on the daybed opened his eyes and tried to speak. He wheezed and struggled for breath before closing his eyes again. The one on the floor began to moan and shake. He was burning hot and began to convulse. Mary dropped the blankets on the table and tried to keep him down. He lashed out uncontrollably and knocked her back, but her father helped her get the man on his side. "David, we need to strip them. These clothes are filthy," Dot said. Her husband was familiar with commands when his wife was in action. David helped her while Mary ran upstairs for more clean sheets. Mary, who had been assisting her mother since she was very young, would likely follow in her mother's footsteps. Mary would be a nurse. The man on the daybed tried to speak, and Dot leaned close to listen. He coughed and gagged several times, but managed to give their names and a bit of information. Once she got him settled, she grabbed her medical book from the sideboard and looked up the symptoms from the book her husband had brought her only a few months before. "Dear God, David," she gasped, "don't let the men go home to their families. Lord, have mercy on us all." Chapter 1. The doctor is tending to women and children in North Harbour. He won't be here for 2 or 3 more days. I'm sorry, Mary Rowe. The man's broken voice was filtered through a wide, ragged strip of cloth which had been torn from his flour sack and was covering his nose and mouth. He didn't look at her in the eye. None of them did. She knew there would be both pity and terror, and she didn't know which would have been worse. "I know." She fell back on the wooden chair and moved out of the way as 4 men shuffled towards the door, carrying her father's body. She couldn't cry. There was work to be done. She heard wood scraping on wood from outside, and the dull thought, as she suspected her father was being placed in the hastily made spruce box that was probably in the snowbank near the doorstep. Wood smoke from the fire pit burning near the house, and the faint smell of tar mixed with the smells in the kitchen. The porch door banged shut, and Dad was gone. The kitchen didn't have the familiar comforting smells of the fresh-baked bread that she had known growing up. Instead, her nostrils filled with the pungent odor of pine tar and turpentine that had been boiling in a dipper on the stove for the last few weeks. She glanced outside and noticed the sun was shining, although the cold from the February morning left a frosty sheen near the bottom of the pane along the sill. She saw a frosted breath as old Belle snorted and shook her head. The small brown mare was tackled to the sleds a few feet from the gate. Mary touched the glass. "You take care of him, you hear? It's precious cargo you'll be carrying to Chapel Hill." Meg Dalton stood near the sawhorse. Instead of watching the house like she did most days, she was wide-eyed as the men who, out of Mary's view, were tar-sealing the crude wooden box containing the body of Mary's father. The 14-year-old's mitted hands covered her face as she cried uncontrollably at the scene before her. The girl crumpled on the sawhorse and looked toward the house. She caught the movement of the curtain as Mary, for the 5th time, pulled away the large piece of canvas marked with an X from the top sash and moved back from the window. Mary's warm fingertips left prints on the cool glass, transparent circles of hope that blended once more into the white frosted pane as the winter air renewed its unrelenting assault. Every sign of life was being stolen from the house, both from the inside and out. Mary adjusted the bandana around her face, washed her hands in the pan on the oven door, and cursed the futile efforts ahead of her as she glanced around at the 11 remaining people spread out in the kitchen and in the pantry. Would the doctor be able to help any of them? She touched her mother's brow, and her emotions suddenly pushed through. "Mom, I wish you could tell me what to do. I wish you could hang on. Please wake up. Please show me. You've helped so many here in this house over the last 40 years, and yet it comes to this. Why did you have to try to help those men from the boat? Why did Dad bring them here? God help me. I can't do this anymore. Mary's whispered pleas were broken by her mother's cough. The gurgling sound she heard from her mother made Mary gasp. She knew her mother would be the 12th person carried out of their home since the 3 strangers were brought in. The tears she wanted to shed for Dad could come later, and she forced her emotions under control. Mary was going to do her best, but she knew her best wasn't good enough, just like her mother's hadn't been, but she was still going to try. Thank you for listening.